Hello, Confectionery Live. It's a delight to be here. I'm thrilled to be with you today. My name's Tom Adams. I'm the co-founder and the chief strategy officer of 60 Decibels. We're a impact measurement company working with corporates and impact investors and international development agencies in now close to 80 countries to help those companies or not-for-profits or governments understand and improve the social impact they make. And I'm thrilled to talk about a topic that is really dear to my heart, which is how are people working in supply chains faring in today's economy, with a particular focus on cocoa farmers. Before I get into cocoa farmers itself, I think it's worth taking a giant step back. My career has gone from traditional finance through to international development, a short and perhaps not very successful career stint as a diplomat, and then into impact investing and now impact measurement. And I think what's excited me most about over the last 20 years or so is that in the past, there might have been a dichotomy between the private and public sectors. That private sector is here to delight customers and shareholders, and any social issues are the responsibility of more or less of governments and charities to fix. And with the rise of corporate social responsibility and impact investing, environmental, social, and governance requirements, it's the private sector has recognized increasingly the contribution it makes to some of the negative social and environmental issues that affect us. But perhaps more exciting is that the private sector is increasingly being seen as part of the solution to these challenges. That the private sector, as well as creating positive financial value, can and must create positive social and environmental value too. And this is reflected in the changing environment in which businesses operate in this century. They've gone to just thinking about return and risk and return to actually thinking about risk, return, and social value. And it matters more and more to consumers. So there is a real carrot for business to demonstrate that they are acting responsibly, acting sustainably, creating social value. As many as 3/4 of consumers now say that they have no problem spending more on a product or service where they feel confident that that product or service is making a positive environmental and social impact. And as well as the carrot of what consumers want, there's also a stick of changing regulation. There's a slew of regulations that are coming through, particularly in Europe, but also in the States. And these sorts of regulations and these requirements to understand and transparently report social and environmental impacts are going to become the new normal of business. We're going to see a change where, rather than companies producing statements of intention and corporate policies that they're going to do certain good things and avoid harmful practices, we're going to see an increasing requirement to disclose impact reports, environmental reports, and we'll expect that investors and consumers will respond to those reports. If we come back to the cocoa sector, actually, the cocoa sector in many ways has been a leader, not a laggard, in this respect for decades. We're familiar with so much of the chocolate we purchase having certification labels on it, whether fair trade or Rainforest Alliance or others, that are based on programs that are working to improve the living conditions of farmers. This is very normal for this sector. And we've also seen an increasing number of specific requirements around tackling human rights issues such as child labour, and a lot of attention placed on that, and an increasing number of requirements around deforestation and other specific environmental issues. And whilst those specific issues are obviously incredibly important, I think one of the absolute key arguments I'd make, and that we believe in at 60 decibels, is that actually a sort of more fundamental issue is going to become perhaps the key sustainability issue. So rather than focus on certain sustainability issues around child labour or forced labour or deforestation as absolutely fundamental as critical as they are, there is this broader question of well-being being sort of overarching umbrella sustainability issue, that farmers who are doing better send their children to school, not to the workplace, that farmers who are doing better are going to invest in their farm. They're less likely to be cutting down protected forest, and that farmers that are doing better are going to see a future in cocoa or coffee or whatever the product they're growing, and are not going to be hoping that their children go on to do something else. And so this big macro sustainability issue is, are the people in our supply chain thriving or barely surviving? And we have much less data on that than we'd like. The processes, the systems by which we can consistently get data to answer that question have yet to be built, and that's limiting our ability to answer this question. It's not just cocoa or indeed supply chains or indeed the private sector that has this challenge of how to understand social impact. This is actually a pretty new field. In the past, it would be that an academic institution would do a specific piece of data collection or research on a specific issue and publish that. But the idea that you'd have systematic information gathered to understand social well-being is very new. And so a lot of the approaches taken to date to demonstrate social impact have looked more at the practices and policies of organizations. Do you have good policies in place around HR? Do you have good practices in place to avoid certain pernicious behaviors happening in the supply chain? Did you implement a training program to help farmers? But actually turning that into data on, well, did this work? Did this improve someone's life? That hasn't systematically been built yet. And if you like, for a parallel, it's kind of like having great practices and policies to understand financial accounting, but without the actual data on financial bottom line. What this has meant is that a lot of the data used by organizations to either report or judge social performance have been repurposed operational measures. We have trained X many farmers. Our program of support has benefited the lives of this many thousands of farmers. And a lot of marketing reports tend to just produce these big numbers, what are often described as vanity metrics, the biggest number I can possibly have. And they don't really tell us what happens to the farmer's well-being. So whether this be in the cocoa sector, supply chain, or actually more broadly in impact investing or other supply chains, and the social sector, it has to be said, increasingly we need to move from data being gathered around what's convenient to measure and actually really ask the question, are we collecting data that is meaningful or material to measure? Does it really tell us about the lives of the farmers in our supply chain and how they're doing? And it turns out that changing that norm is nowhere near as difficult as it used to be. In the past, research, particularly for issues like the cocoa sector, would require people going to some pretty far-flung places with a clipboard, asking really long surveys of people, and the cost of that was often prohibitive. But we can listen to people now much more easily, and listening to people so that they can describe what things change in their lives, which things are material, and then how much change. We can do that and collect and gather much more useful and robust data than ever before. And I think you're going to see that there is going to be a growth in standardized measurement tools that can be delivered cost effectively, that gather data and can actually produce benchmarks of performance, so that people aren't saying, well, look, I've done my own little bit of piecemeal measurement here, and I can say these things are improving, and here are my metrics. And then someone else does it somewhere else, and they use slightly different research tools and a slightly different method, and no one can compare the two. We're going to see it, an increasing number of measurement tools and measurement service providers provide this quality, repeatable social research to provide us with these benchmarks of impact. And if we do, then we're going to know a hell of a lot more about how and where and why farmers are thriving or just getting by. And that's going to teach us a lot, not just about, not just that we can communicate that better, but also then we can start to understand, well, what programs are really working, what policies both benefit farmers the most. Should we be paying premiums or having minimum prices? Should we be training in this way or that? Should we be providing what different types of inputs to farmers? Should we be providing wraparound financing for farmers? There are so many different things that are approaches to help farmers improve and increase their margin and the profitability of their farms, but actually less that is systematically understood and systematically measured about the effectiveness of different policies and programs. So we've worked 60 Decibels has been going for 4 years since we spun out of an impact investing organization called Acumen. In that time, we've worked with hundreds of organizations working to improve the lives of farmers, be they large corporates through to small social enterprises that might be providing a very particular input for a farmer. And we've listened to hundreds of thousands of farmers describe their experience of these policies and programs. And we have brought that information together to produce a new measurement tool called the Farmer Thriving Index, which we piloted last year in Ghana, and will be growing across a significant amount of our work to create more and more useful benchmarks that ask questions about the lived experience of farmers to make an assessment of whether or not farmers are getting by and whether their lives are improving. And it asks questions over a range of very familiar topics. Whether or not farmers earning a living income based on a set of consumption-based questions, their financial resilience, critically a farmer's self-assessment of their sustainability. So there's so much work on sustainability which is sort of top down. I think we forget sometimes to ask farmers for their views of whether or not cocoa farming or coffee farming they view it as a sustainable activity. Their food security, whether they're unfortunately having to adopt certain coping strategies, reducing the amount of food they might be eating, and obviously we want to see less of that in to demonstrate the farmers are doing better, and some questions on human and environmental risk. And we can ask this question in a standardized way by phone in a conversation with the farmer that takes 10 to 15 minutes, get a quantitative and qualitative data, and produce some scoring. And from our pilot, we can see that farmers are the average farmer is not in crisis, but there is also quite a long way to go before your average farmer could be described as starting to really excel. And we can break down the data to look at the performance across different aspects of our Thriving Index, and I'll come on to in a minute how companies might be able to use that data. We can also produce insights around what might be happening, so that underneath that general performance score, so that we can start questions around who might be doing better and why, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we see already that male farmers are more likely to be earning a living income than female farmers. And also just the extent to which farmers may struggle to raise funds in an emergency. This is actually a question that we ask not just of farmers, but also of people who might be engaged in microfinance or even off-grid energy. How difficult would it be to come up with a specific amount of funding relevant to the sector or the country we're in, if there was an emergency? And you can see this kind of data would be critical to organizations if they want to ensure that farmers are resilient and aren't having to sell key assets or engage in potentially non-farm activities in order to raise cash at a short period of time when shocks arise. And unfortunately, we're going to see more and more shocks and due to the climate affecting farmers as we go forward. ultimately, it's our great hope that this information is of value to the sector. I mean, data by itself doesn't help anyone's life. It doesn't help someone come out of poverty. It's only when organizations are using data to make better and more informed decisions that data is of value to everyone. And I think the growing use of tools like this that provide clarity over how farmers are living, whether they're doing better or worse through our supply chains, is going to allow organizations to judge their performance and look at industry benchmarks and say, look, ask questions, and potentially sometimes uncomfortable questions, of how are we doing compared to peers? How could we improve? Are we behind or not? And they can communicate that if they're doing particularly well to consumers. And it's our strong belief that consumers will start to respond to information like that looks credibly at the lives of the people that are making something as delicious as chocolate, and see how they're doing, and see that they are actually also benefiting from taking part in a supply chain that delivers us something so amazing. For me, perhaps more often than I ought to eat chocolate. And that this will also be relevant to investors as investors make decisions, and as we start to create data that gives us better and better data to meet ESG reporting requirements. So hopefully I've given you an explanation of why the issue of not just a specific human rights and supply chain issues are going to be are critical, but this more broader issue of farmer well-being as what we see as the key sustainability issue, the sort of overarching sustainability issue going forward, and how organizations that are committed to understanding the well-being of their farmers we're going to find it increasingly easy to use tools that give real clarity about how farmers are doing in supply chains, and the value that will create, both from improving our programs and our policies and our actions to support farmers, communicating that to both customers and shareholders. It's been a real privilege to be here today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.